Well, every day we make choices, and those choices that we make every day will say a lot about who we are. We'll make choices with the kind of people we want to hang out with. We'll make choices of how we want to spend our day and the things that we want to do in our day. We'll allow the things around us to influence us. The question will be, will we be influencers or will we allow other things to influence us? So we're constantly filled with all those questions. And the gospel writers all give us some indications that as we look at this trial of Jesus, as he has now been arrested and he is before some pretty significant individuals, all the gospel accounts tell us that there are three groups of people involved in this whole trial of Jesus. And the question today is going to be, as we finish our message, is we're going to wrestle with which one of those groups are we. Every one of us in the room is one of those groups of people, and my hope is that as we journey together in this message, it'll give us a pretty clear insight as to where we are, but more importantly, how God's grace can lead us around that into a greater impact and deeper message and heart with Christ himself. I want to welcome those that are live streaming with us. Welcome. We're glad that you're here and tuning in with us. We have folks, a couple hundred folks every week, who are sitting at home right now enjoying a nice breakfast and watching worship. So maybe one day we'll come and have worship at your house and you can feed us breakfast. So again, we're so glad that you're with us today. Well, as we look at these three groups of people, the first group we come to are the priests. And the priests are the kinds of folks that represent the sins of greed and envy. So greed and envy. So who are these priests? The priests are the ones that did not want at all this ministry of Jesus to get off the ground. They didn't want it to be successful at all. They were the ones who were the power brokers. They held on to all the rites of worship and the legalisms of what the temple could be. And they were the ones in charge of telling people like you and me, if we were Jewish, what we could and couldn't do. And they were also the ones that would look at us as people who weren't Jewish and say that you aren't a part of God's plan. So we know that when Jesus came, God in the flesh into the world and began to proclaim this message of holiness, this message of God's love and grace for all people, even the Gentiles, that this group did not like that. So they were doing everything in their power to try and make sure that Jesus as Messiah was not something that would happen. Luke writes it this way, is Jesus is taken in front of the Sanhedrin. Luke gives us a specific account as to what happens. He writes, at daybreak, and that word is going to be significant for us to hold on to. At daybreak, the council of elders of the people, both the chief priests and teachers of the law, they met together, and Jesus was led before them. Now listen to this. If you are the Christ, they said, tell us. So they're fishing. They're trying to get Jesus to answer this question because in their minds, if Jesus says he is indeed the Christ, they think that they can issue a charge of blasphemy and therefore call upon Rome to execute Jesus. But Jesus answered, if I tell you, you're not going to believe me. And if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God. And they all asked, are you then the Son of God? And he, Jesus, replied, you are right in saying I am. And then they said, why do we need any more listening? Why do we need any more testimony at all? We've heard it from his own lips. Well, the Sanhedrin was like the Supreme Court of Judaism. And they met in some pretty significant ways. And as they met together, they had complete jurisdiction over all religious matters. So anytime that there was something that was going on that was against the matters of religion, of Judaism, so to speak, the Sanhedrin would get involved. They were not allowed to meet in the hours of darkness. And that's why I said it's really important for us to hold on to those words that Luke says, that very early in the morning, because we know that Jesus has been on trial all throughout the evening. And that was totally against all the principles of which Judaism was built upon. It could only meet in the hall of the hewn stone in the court of the temple. And here we find out that they're meeting behind closed doors in a place that is not the normal place where they normally would meet. So the court, if you can imagine, the court sat together in a semicircle. And in that semicircle, basically all of you would be in a semicircle. I would be the accused. I would be standing before you. And you all would be in a semicircle around. And what we would see in this is we would see the rabbis and the scribes and the elders and all those individuals going by rank all the way back to the youngest in the very back of the room. Interestingly, when someone was brought before the Sanhedrin on charges, whatever those charges were, the only questions that they could ask and the only comments that they could make were ones to help prove one's innocence. not their guilt. But we learn a little bit about some of their ways in which they're trying Jesus here, that they're breaking all of their own rules, so to speak, and they're making sure that their own agenda is one that will get Jesus to the cross. Now, anytime that they came to a verdict, the law said that they had to wait at least 2 nights, sleep on it, so to speak. How many of you sleep on some pretty significant decisions? We always do. We always get people, when we tell them we're going to make a purchase or something, we need to sleep on it, we need to pray about it, they're dumbfounded. Well, the law said that you had to sleep on it for 2 days. And it was that the high priest could not issue a sentence of death. And we see that this whole system was built upon bringing mercy to the person who was brought to trial. But yet the experience that the gospel writers give us about Jesus before the Sanhedrin that night and before Pilate and the others was anything but merciful. Here's a couple of ways in which they violated their own rules, so to speak, and we know that Jesus did not have a fair trial. The proceedings did not take place in the temple. Jesus was allowed no defense. He doesn't blaspheme in the technical sense of the term by using the divine name. The verdict comes on the same day as the trial, which was prohibited. Jesus is being tried on a feast day, and that was always prohibited. You never did that on a feast day. Contradictory testimony is supported to exonerate the defendant, whereas we learned that they were only supposed to bring forward testimony that showed the innocence of somebody, but yet they brought forward testimony that said of guilt. And the high priest is not supposed to issue the pronouncement of guilt. Yet in this instance, we see clearly that they are not even following their own rules. It's a haste to judgment. It's a haste to make sure that Jesus does not proclaim himself to be Messiah, let alone rise and take away the power in which the people were so fearful he would do. Finally, we imagine Jesus standing before his accusers. He's facing the same fate, the very thing that he himself had predicted on so many occasions. Recall the many times that he said to the disciples that the time would come that the Son of Man must pay the price, must die for the sins of humanity. And in all those instances, even though that they traveled very closely with Jesus, they never really connected the dots, did they? But yet we sense here something significant is happening. Jesus faces death so others like you and I may face life. He goes to death, so to speak, under the charges of death, so that you and I, who are really guilty through our sin of death, so to speak, that we are set free. But yet he had to pay the price. And the reality is, without our sinfulness, he would have never been able to justify standing before the Sanhedrin in the first place. But because he knew and knows today of the sinful creatures that we are, God continues to justify. He continues to pardon. He continues to give of himself so that we might have new life. The second group that we come in contact with this story is the prisoner Barabbas. Barabbas, he basically represents the sin of hate. Barabbas has been arrested. He's been committing crimes, whereas the Gospels don't really tell us exactly what crimes he's committed. We do know that he's somewhat of an insurrectionist, that he's leading some kind of movement. We know that before Jesus, there were several in that time period and even before who had led uprisings against Rome, who called themselves messiahs, insurrection, so to speak, trying to overthrow Rome and kick them out to give the people of Judea and Israel their own ways back to without worrying about the oppression of Rome. Barabbas likely was a thief, and we know all throughout in the region of Galilee, there was lots of things that were stolen because there were such classism differences. Like today in our society, we have classism. We have the wells and the well-to-do, and we have those without. And we began to see also in the ancient world that classism existed there. So Barabbas might have been a thief, and he might have been like a Robin Hood of his day, where he was stealing from the rich so that he could give to the poor. But regardless, he was a criminal. He was charged, he was arrested, he was thrown into jail, and more importantly, the fear was that he might be one who would lead up another uprising that would come and try to destroy Rome. I find it ironic, absolutely ironic, that the crowds are shouting to free Jesus Barabbas. That's his name, Jesus Barabbas. Barabbas' name actually translates son of the Father. And Jesus' name also translates son of the Father. So there's some interesting things that are happening in this story. And they call for the freeing of Barabbas, but it doesn't make Jesus guilty. They choose crucifixion for Jesus. And Pilate asks the question, why? Why do you want me to crucify Jesus and not Barabbas? Why do you want me to release Barabbas and not Jesus? And the crowd's rancor exceeds. It becomes even more emotional, and they begin to drown Pilate out. But here's the irony. Jesus, who had no interest in causing social upheaval, will be crucified between two criminals. Barabbas, a criminal guilty of murder, will go free, and Jesus has taken his place on the cross, a cross that was intended for Barabbas, not Jesus. The crowd chooses the one who takes the lives of others to achieve his own selfish ends, and the crowd condemns the one who gives his life for others in obedience to God. Do you see the irony? Do you see the significance? Do you see what's happening in this story? The crowd wants a king who will be comfortable with murder and mayhem, and not one who refuses to resist evil with violence. They want a warrior, but yet they receive one who is of peace. Here's the third group that we look at in the story, and it's actually Pilate. Pontius Pilate, the procurator of Rome. He is the one who represents the sin of indifference. The sin of indifference. Pilate presents a state which is concerned only with the preserving of order. As long as there's order, Pilate is happy. As long as there's not an insurrection against Rome, Pilate is happy. He will do everything that he can to appease the people who are around him. But the question becomes, is he not in charge or not? Pilate had the power to make the right decision, to go against what the people had ordered. He asked the crowd, do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews? And what shall I do then with the one who's called the King of the Jews? And he puts on this feeble protest like he even cares in front of the people when the riotous crowd calls for Jesus' death. And finally, when he issues the edict, because only Rome could issue the decree of death. And Pilate calls for that. He's the governor who can do what he pleases. He can do what he wishes. And yet, he panders to the crowd. He plays it up. He goes along with the loudness of the voices that are crying against him. I asked you earlier, which one of these people are you? Which one are you of this group that put Jesus on trial? Maybe you succumb to envy. Maybe you're envious of what others have or what you feel that you deserve. Maybe that you want power. You're hungry for some kind of power that you just don't have, but yet you feel you deserve that and you want that and you need that. Maybe that's you. Maybe like Barabbas, you're rebelling within and your motives aren't holy and they lead you to become an enemy of others. Or maybe you're Pilate. You see yourself in him. You might be one who panders with the crowds. You can't make a decision. You listen to what's happening. You put your finger to the wind. Which way is the wind blowing? What's the politically correct thing? How can I make a decision that nobody will be angry with me? How can I please everybody around me? That's Pilate. You merely want to satisfy the crowd, whose intentions you know that are less desirable, whose intentions of the crowd are not honorable, and you allow others to make decisions in your life. I think looking at this, I think probably most of us would say we're probably more like Pilate. We're probably more like Pontius Pilate because we prefer Jesus to be the envious and over the envious and greedy high priests. We prefer Jesus over the violent Barabbas, but that's about as far as it goes. We don't want to be seen as greedy. We don't want to be seen as violent. We see no harm in Jesus, but we also know that we don't see anything else. We don't want to risk anything for him. We want to play it easy. We want to stay comfortable. We want to be complacent. As long as faith can be kept in a box. That's what Pilate is. We regard Jesus simply as King of the Jews. And we have no intention to herald him as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Barabbas appeals to our basic instinct because Barabbas is the one who wants to protect our interests with violence if necessary. You know as well as I do, in today's generation, we seem to want to attack things and get involved in things and resolve things through violent means. We would rather argue and tear down one another and fight one another rather than coming together in a sense of holiness to work things out. We want to draw lines. I'm right, you're wrong, you're right, I'm wrong. and we lose the sense of what peace and the pursuit is. Our heroes become the Barabbases of the world, who take matters into their own hands, who dispatch the enemy with brute force or clever trickery. Make no mistake, I'm convinced if the vote happened again today, Barabbas would win. And we'd say, free Barabbas, send Jesus to the cross, crucify him, nail him there. And Barabbas would win, hands down. God's way, though, of dealing with all of this is totally mind-boggling. God didn't come into the world as a warrior king. He instead came quietly. He became part of a womb of a woman in the egg within inside of her and was born into the world as a baby. He comes into the world peacefully. But on the cross, we see that God, as Jesus in the flesh, takes the sting of death once and for all. And our failure to choose this way stems from our desire to totally trust God. And the funny thing is, we say that we trust God to take care of us in the afterlife. Well, I'm saved, I know where I'm going, but yet we don't trust God in this life. We must make choices. We must be true. But here we are. Jesus took the place of a condemned man. He didn't volunteer to die specifically for Barabbas, but he chose and he volunteered to die for all of us. That death goes beyond for the sins of humanity. He accepted the brunt of those who live with envy. He accepted the brunt of those who are indifferent, who aren't upfront, so to speak, and don't do business or don't deal with life in the right way. It's the murderous Barabbas that he sees in all of us, and he takes away the guilt. So this morning we've seen it. We've seen the religious leaders, the one that are so wanting to protect the interests that they have, that they did not see the religious leaders. We saw the authority figure that pandered to the public. Which way is the wind blowing? What should my decision be today that's going to cause me the least amount of resistance? Even though the decision that needs to be made is the right one, I want to please everybody and choose their way. Or is it Barabbas, the murderous rebel, the one who was misdirected, but yet the Lord took his place on the cross? So let me ask again, which one are you? Which one of these individuals are you?